Hi, Joon Yoon here, at a party in the 20s. Now here's an odd sight. Women wearing short dresses and with cut hair and smoking and drinking. Before this, it was tradition for them to act conservatively and dress the part as well. This liberation from tradition happened because of growth in consumerism, interest in mass entertainment, and a so-called revolution in morals and manners. I really want to learn more. But first, we need to learn about what led up to this point. How did changing cultural norms affect women in the 1920s? There are 3 important points to consider: historical background leading up to the 20s, mass culture, and domestic improvement in the 20s. These were the things that impacted women most hugely. So now, let's dig deeper.
So even since the beginning of American history, women have always been leading reform movements and enact social change. Even if they weren't explicitly fighting for themselves, they were always fighting for some moral standard. 2 most important ones leading up to the 20s would be the fight for temperance and the fight for women's suffrage. Temperance is a movement that dated back to the early 19th century, which was basically a religious movement that wanted to see the limitation of alcohol. They wanted to limit its sale and manufacture, and this was mainly brought about by a desire to prevent their husbands and men in general from going out and getting drunk without restraint, so they could focus more on their family and their jobs so that they could provide. Now, the temperance is really important for a couple of reasons. It really sets up the 20s because eventually the temperance movement gets the 18th Amendment passed. The 18th Amendment would be ratified in 1919, and it basically said manufacture and sale of alcohol was now illegal. What this would do is that it would increase the black market for alcohol and produce a rise in gang violence and more loose morals, because alcohol is something that people always want throughout history. This is what would lead to the speakeasies and clubs that really developed the flapper movement, for example, where women were becoming of more looser morals and attitudes. Even just before this, it was completely unheard of and contrary to culture to see a woman out drinking. Attitudes became far more liberal, and it really allowed women to shape their own role in a changing society. The other big impact of temperance is that it gave them a safe zone for political activism. From this movement, they garnered experience that would be crucial to movements such as women's suffrage, which would vastly increase their political agency, and it gave them a voice in politics, even despite not being able to vote. It essentially gave them permission from a male-dominated society to have a voice for change, even when no one wanted them to have a voice for change. Of course, they would get the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Now, this completely changed the landscape of the American political scene. It gave women that voice in politics that they had been fighting and yearning for so long, and really helped shape the cultural swing that would take place after the ratification. In contributing to this, there was another big development that really improved women's agency, and that was World War I, because now all the men were drafted to go to war, the women were staying at home and making up the workforce of America, and now the concept of women having a laboring job wasn't so foreign, because now they were doing it with World War I. It was a real development, honestly, because now they could have jobs that were traditionally seen as being only for men, and it really helped them develop a more sense of self and being apart from the man. There is also a minor development before the 20s that would become much more important later, and that is the creation of birth control.
Wow, it's so good to see
Wow,
you again.
Calista, what have you been doing lately?
I've been here doing normal things.
Well, wait, what is that? What have you been doing lately?
I forgot to
my.
tell you, I got pregnant a few weeks ago.
That is not something you should be doing.
But it's okay. Like, I heard this thing called like birth control by like Margaret Sanger. Do you know
Birth
Margaret?
control?
Yeah, Margaret's like my best friend.
What is that?
It gave women this voice to say, this is my body, I'll do what I want with it. It's more a display, an illustration of how women were gaining power and were developing ways to exert that power. now, because now they could control whether they got pregnant. In summary, a couple of big events leading up to the 20s really helped shape the women of that era. The 18th Amendment would really set the stage for women to be able to be more promiscuous, image of a more independent person, and things like the development of birth control really illustrated that, as it showed women starting to take control, sticking it to the man and instead just going out on their own and establishing their own lives and image. And now we get to the 20s, which is what the majority of this video will be focused on. Now, you can't talk about women in the 20s without talking of the flapper movement, in which women started dressing less conservatively and acting more wildly, and in essence, were trying to act more like men. This movement came about for a number of reasons, many of which have already been discussed in the previous section. However, there are a couple of other things to note. The center of the movement was a desire by women to be treated more like men and to be able to act the way men did. And this showed itself in how women started gaining jobs that traditionally only men held, but also manifested itself in women's desire to go out and smoke, drink, and act promiscuously. The economic boom of the war also meant that there was more time for leisure activities such as golf or tennis, and for that, maneuverability was key, and more traditional conservative dress was not really practical for those activities. And from that need for more flexibility from their clothing evolved the style of dress that we now think of as the flappers as wearing. So what exactly did the flapper movement mean for women? Well, in terms of aesthetics, it meant shorter hair, shorter dresses, and overall showing more skin. Practically, it meant women were going out more and exploring their changing gender roles in a society that had steadily given them more agency. They could now escape their traditional domestic roles and being tied to the house all day, and could go out and enjoy life as they wanted to. Due to prohibition, the rise of speakeasies gave them an easy outlet to do such things and explore their newfound freedoms. And in these speakeasies, they drank, they smoked, and they explored their sexuality in a way that really hadn't been done before. Musical movements such as the jazz movement, and within that the Harlem Renaissance, also really helped shape these women's lives as the 20s went on. You had singers like Bessie Smith who used their musical talent to provide more of a voice for themselves and really contribute to the rise of this jazz scene, which also really helped solidify the image of the flapper. It was in these clubs where we get the image that we traditionally think of a flapper now, where they're dancing to music and drinking in these clubs while enjoying the entertainment provided to them. It's with the rise of this music movement that really concurred and is intertwined with the development of the flapper. Above all else, though, the flapper movement was an expression of individuality for women and trying to break away from the traditional ties to their husbands and their domestic lives. It was a really progressive movement in that sense and aroused a lot of conflict with other social groups. It should be noted that the majority of the flapper movement happened in the eastern cities where these speakeasies were more common. Controversy arose over how these women acted. For example, some banks in the United States hit their women employees with strict dress codes because of complaints over their immoral behavior in the public eye and the fear that it could spread, and pushing back against the gender roles that society had traditionally assigned them, instead choosing to go out and be their own selves. However, it wasn't just out in the streets and in the shops where women's roles were changing. There were also many things at home that changed for women that allowed them to become more independent. The invention of household appliances such as the vacuum cleaner or the toaster or washing machines took away much of the time women had to spend on housework. This is what really stimulated their role outside of the house and gave them more time to spend on leisure and to go to these speakeasies and embrace the flapper culture. This is what really started separating women from their traditional association with housework, because now they didn't have to do so much of it because of all these new inventions that gave them so much more time to use how they wanted. There were even inventions outside the house that helped women develop this more independent nature. There was the development of the Ford Model T, for example, which was a cheap, affordable automobile for the average American. This allowed women to travel more easily between home and places they wanted to go to for their leisure time, and subsequently allowing them to participate in the movements that would solidify their image in the 20s. And this all led to a sense of changing gender roles at home, because now women could hold jobs, and instead of spending all their time at home being dominated by their husbands, they could go out and spend their time however they wanted to. In general, there was a less of an emphasis on the traditional American family model, where the wife was the housekeeper and the caretaker, and the father was the breadwinner. In the eastern cities, where the flapper movement was really centered, this kind of model started to decline a bit. The biggest deviation from this, of course, was the increased exploring of their sexuality and their promiscuity. They started sleeping around with different men. They weren't necessarily waiting for marriage to prove their worth. With all these changing circumstances outside of home, they could live outside of tradition instead of just being stuck at home. And the changing times and cultural norms also changed their role within the house and caused them to start challenging what had already been set out for them.
And that was the 20s. Historical context, mass culture, and domestic improvements changed the role of women in America forever. They gained more agency in politics, adapted to changing gender roles, and in general just acted less conservatively and broke tradition.
And remember, don't forget about the women's suffrage, birth control, temperance movement, jazz age, flappers, and inventions like vacuum cleaners.
But we hope to inform you more next time on this channel. Please subscribe to A Push History 17. Yoon Lista out.